We live in a world that rewards noise, louder voices, longer explanations, constant availability. But in all this volume, something essential gets lost. The presence, the clarity, the impact. We've mistaken talking for connection and performance for truth. But what if we're looking in the wrong direction? What if the real strength isn't in how much we say, but in how deeply we mean what we say? Lao Tzu once said, "He who knows does not speak. He who speaks does not know." And while that might sound extreme, the message holds weight. Wisdom often lives in silence, and when we speak, we should do so with purpose, not to fill space. This isn't about being quiet, it's about being intentional, speaking not to be heard, but to be felt. This episode isn't a guide for better small talk. It's an invitation to step into the power of restraint, to explore the spaces between words and the strength that emerges when we choose to speak less, but with more meaning. Because there's a difference between making noise and making impact. And when you master the art of saying less, you begin to create space, not only for others to hear you, but for you to hear yourself. If you've ever felt overwhelmed by the need to explain, to convince, to prove your worth through speech, this conversation is for you. It's not about becoming passive. It's about becoming precise. Because when your words are few, but true, they echo. There's something deeply unsettling about silence, especially in a world that measures relevance by visibility and confidence by how quickly you respond. Silence, for many, feels like weakness, an empty space to be filled. But what if that silence isn't emptiness at all? What if it's actually substance, the place where presence begins and noise ends? We speak because we want to be seen. We speak to assert ourselves, to be understood, to belong. But in the process, we sometimes forget that speaking is only part of communication, and not the most powerful part, because power doesn't come from speaking more. It comes from speaking with meaning, and that meaning often starts in the moments when we choose not to speak at all. There's a quote attributed to Blaise Pascal that captures this tension. All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone. And it's true, not just in solitude, but in interaction. We rush to speak because silence makes us uncomfortable. It leaves us exposed, vulnerable. But that discomfort is where truth lives. In those few seconds of hesitation, that's where the real connection waits. When you resist the urge to fill the space, you begin to hear more around you and within you. The thoughts behind the words, the emotion behind the tone, the intention behind the presence. And suddenly, silence becomes a kind of awareness, a container for depth, not absence. The more you allow for silence, the more meaning your words begin to carry. Speaking less doesn't mean withdrawing. It means refining. It means understanding that your voice isn't strong because it's constant, but because it's conscious. When you stop performing and start listening, even to yourself, your words stop becoming noise and start becoming signals. And that signal, when delivered with presence, cuts through everything. To be quiet is not to be passive. It's to be grounded, to observe, to feel fully, and to wait for the right moment to say the one thing that actually matters. That's the difference between those who speak to be heard and those who speak to be remembered. The next time you feel that instinct to speak, to respond quickly, to fill the pause, ask yourself, is this coming from presence or from pressure? And if it's pressure, pause, breathe. Because in that pause, something real can emerge. Not the surface-level answer, but the truth that lives beneath it. You'll notice that when you give yourself space to listen before speaking, your words carry more weight. People pay closer attention, not because you're loud, but because you're deliberate. And that deliberateness becomes a kind of magnetism, quiet, steady, undeniable. So maybe it's not about learning how to say more. Maybe it's about learning to say less, so that when you do speak, every word actually means something. And maybe that's the kind of voice the world needs more of. There's a discipline most people underestimate. It's not flashy. It doesn't draw applause, but it's one of the rarest and most impactful forms of communication you can master: the art of precision. In a culture that often equates speaking more with saying more, choosing your words carefully has become an act of quiet rebellion. To be precise is to be deliberate, not in a cold, calculating way, but in a way that honors the value of what you say. It means asking yourself, does this need to be said? And if so, how clearly can I say it? That kind of restraint is not restrictive, it's freeing. Because when you stop over-explaining, over-justifying, and over-speaking, what remains is pure intention. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." Simple words, hard practice. Precision asks for honesty, not only with others, but with yourself. You can't speak with impact if you don't know what you stand for, and you can't speak with clarity if your mind is cluttered with noise. But clarity doesn't always come before the words. Sometimes it emerges in the pause before you speak. That breath where you choose presence over performance, where you don't reach for the most impressive phrase, but the most accurate one, the one that lands softly, but stays. And here's the paradox. When you say less, people listen more, because your words don't come across as automatic. They come across as earned. You speak not to fill space, but to offer something meaningful. And in doing so, you give people something rare. The feeling that what you're saying is exactly what needs to be said, and nothing more. This kind of speech feels different. There's no rush, no excess, just focus, just stillness. And from that stillness, power, the kind that doesn't need to raise its voice, the kind that doesn't need to prove its value. Because it's rooted, it's clean, and it carries the authority of someone who doesn't waste what's precious. Being precise is not about perfection, it's about intention. It's not about sounding smart, it's about being real. And when your words become a reflection of that inner clarity, people notice. They may not understand why, but they'll feel it. So the next time you speak, ask yourself, not just what am I saying, but why am I saying it? Can I express this in fewer words? Can I say it in a way that leaves no doubt about what I mean, but still leaves room for others to breathe? Because sometimes the most impactful message is the one that knows exactly when to end. Most people hear to reply. Few truly listen to understand, and even fewer know how to let what they hear change them. Listening isn't passive, it's presence in motion. It's a decision to turn down the volume of your own thoughts long enough to fully receive someone else's. And in a world that rushes to speak, the ability to truly listen might be one of the most radical forms of connection we still have. We often mistake listening for silence, but it's not just about keeping quiet. It's about being receptive. It's a mental posture, not just a physical one. To listen deeply, you have to let go of your need to be right, your urge to respond, your habit of defending your point of view before the other person's even done speaking. It's not easy, but it's rare because it's powerful. The philosopher Epictetus once said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." It sounds simple, almost obvious, but think about how rarely we live that truth. We listen half-heartedly, waiting for our chance to speak. We interrupt, we assume, we fill in the blanks before the sentence is even finished, and then we wonder why connection feels out of reach. But when you really listen, when you offer your full attention without trying to control the moment, something opens. The person in front of you begins to soften, not because you've said something brilliant, but because you've created a space safe enough for their truth to unfold. And from that space, deeper conversations emerge, misunderstandings unravel, assumptions dissolve. And it's not just about listening to others, it's also about learning to listen to yourself. Beneath the thoughts and reactions, there's a quiet voice. Not the one driven by fear or ego, but the one that knows, the one that sees clearly when the noise fades. Listening to that voice requires stillness, it requires humility, and most of all, it requires trust, that even in silence you are still communicating something real. Because here's the thing, you can't speak with depth if you don't live with it first. And depth begins in silence, in receptivity, in the willingness to hear something before you respond to it. Listening is not just preparation for speaking, it's where the quality of your speech is born. So ask yourself, do you really listen, or do you just wait for your turn to talk? Do you allow space for someone else's truth, or do you rush to insert your own? And when you're alone, do you hear what your own silence is trying to tell you? Because the truth is, listening shapes everything, your relationships, your presence, your clarity, and when you start listening, not just hearing, you speak less, but you say far more. Words are never just words. They carry weight. Some lift, some cut, some echo long after they're spoken, and yet we throw them around carelessly, out of habit, out of reaction, out of the need to fill the silence. But once spoken, a word can't be taken back. It settles, it lands, it shapes how people remember you, how they feel around you, and even how you begin to see yourself. And that's what makes communication sacred. It's not just what you say, it's what you leave behind. The ancient Chinese philosopher Confucius said, "Words are the voice of the heart." And if that's true, then every sentence you speak is a reflection of what's happening inside you. Your clarity, your confusion, your peace, your fear. The weight of your words is measured not in their volume, but in their alignment with who you really are. When your words and your inner world are aligned, people feel it. There's a natural confidence that doesn't need to be loud. It's not forced. It doesn't try to dominate. It simply resonates. Because truth, spoken with integrity, has a frequency of its own. It doesn't have to convince. It just is. But when there's a disconnect between what you say and what you feel, people sense that too. There's a subtle tension, a confusion in your tone, a lack of clarity in your message. And even if the words sound polished, they fall flat, because they're not anchored in anything real. This is why the weight of your words matters. Not because you have to be perfect, but because you have to be present. You have to mean what you say, not just mentally, but emotionally, energetically. Because the people listening to you aren't just picking up your words, they're picking up your energy, your presence, and they can feel whether you're connected to what you're saying or just performing. So the challenge isn't to speak more clearly, it's to live more clearly, to speak from a place that is clean, honest, aligned. And to do that, you have to slow down, to pause, to reflect before you speak. Not to censor yourself, but to honor the fact that what you say matters. And this applies to the small things, not just the big ones. A single sentence can lift someone's day, or break it. A careless remark can linger in someone's mind for years. A moment of honesty, shared with kindness, can rebuild a relationship. And sometimes saying nothing at all can speak volumes, if that silence is held with presence. So ask yourself, are your words adding noise or creating space? Are you speaking to be right or to be real? And if your words are the voice of your heart, what exactly is your heart trying to say? Because when your words are aligned with your truth, you don't need many, just the right ones, spoken at the right time. And those words, they carry more than meaning, they carry you. We often assume that the most powerful part of what we say is, well, what we say. But that's only half the story. The other half lives in what we don't say, how we move, how we hold space, how we show up without needing to dominate the moment. Non-verbal communication is not secondary. It's not a bonus or an afterthought. It's the core of how we're felt. And how you're felt will always speak louder than what you say. Before you even open your mouth, your posture has already spoken. Your eyes have already sent a message. Your tone, your presence, your stillness, or your tension, all of it is already shaping how others receive you. And no matter how articulate your words may be, if your energy contradicts them, people won't remember the message. They'll remember the mismatch. As Friedrich Nietzsche once said, all credibility, all good conscience, all evidence of truth comes only from the senses. We trust what we feel far more than what we hear. And when someone's non-verbal signals are aligned with their words, we lean in. We believe them, not because they said it perfectly, but because their presence confirmed what their mouth was trying to express. This is why emotional regulation is a form of communication. If you speak calmly but your body is tight with tension, people won't hear calm, they'll feel unease. If you smile while your eyes look away in discomfort, people don't register warmth. They register incongruence. Your energy always speaks first. But when your body, your tone, your silence all point in the same direction, toward truth, toward clarity, toward groundedness, something shifts. Trust happens. Not because you worked hard to earn it with logic or persuasion, but because you embodied it. This doesn't mean you have to be polished or perfect. In fact, too much polish creates distance. What we're drawn to isn't flawlessness, it's authenticity, a moment of honest eye contact, a steady breath in the middle of uncertainty, a calm voice that doesn't beg to be heard, but invites attention through presence. Start to observe how you show up without speaking, how you sit in a room, how you walk into a conversation, what energy you carry in silence, because that's not a background detail, it's the headline. And often, it's what people remember long after they've forgotten your words. So here's something to reflect on. What message is your body sending before your words even arrive? What tone is your presence creating without saying a single thing? When words and presence align, you don't need to raise your voice. You don't need to say it twice. You become the message, and that kind of communication never gets lost. Most people try to influence by speaking louder, arguing harder, or trying to sound more convincing. But real influence doesn't begin in the mouth. It begins in the mind, not just your own, but the one you're speaking to. And the bridge between those two isn't force, it's curiosity. Curiosity is quiet. It doesn't push, it invites. It doesn't try to win, it tries to understand. And in that simple shift, from trying to be interesting to being interested, everything changes. The other person relaxes. Their defenses drop. They stop feeling like they're being sold and start feeling like they're being seen. Socrates once said, "The only true wisdom is in knowing you know nothing." That's the essence of influence through curiosity. It's not about showing off what you know. It's about creating space for the unknown to emerge, for real dialogue, for discovery. And ironically, that's what makes people trust you, not your certainty, but your willingness to question with humility. We live in a time where everyone wants to be heard, but few want to listen. And yet, the people who listen deeply, who ask thoughtful questions, who stay open, are the ones who shape conversations and even shift beliefs. Not by overpowering, but by connecting. When you approach someone with genuine curiosity, you're not trying to convince them of anything. You're trying to understand what matters to them, what they fear, what they care about. And once you understand that, your words become more targeted, not manipulative, but meaningful. You're no longer speaking at someone, you're speaking with them. This kind of influence doesn't work in every room, but in the rooms that matter, the ones where trust is required, where nuance is everything, it's unmatched, because it's real, because it honors the complexity of people instead of flattening them into positions or labels. Curiosity also makes you a better thinker. When you stop needing to be right all the time, you free yourself to explore, to ask better questions, to admit when something doesn't make sense yet, and that vulnerability doesn't weaken your influence, it strengthens it, because people can feel the difference between someone trying to dominate and someone genuinely trying to learn. So ask yourself, when you speak, are you trying to lead or to listen? Are you trying to impress or to explore? Are you curious enough to let the conversation change you, not just the other person? Because in the end, influence isn't about control, it's about resonance. And nothing resonates more than the presence of someone who's not pretending to know it all, but who's open enough to truly connect. There's something sacred about the pause, that brief, weightless moment between one word and the next, between a question and its answer, between thought and expression. Most people rush through it, afraid of what might surface in the stillness. But if you learn to stay in that space, to befriend the silence between your sentences, you discover something powerful, that how you speak is just as important as what you say. We tend to think of communication as a stream of uninterrupted sound, but real communication breathes. It inhales and exhales. It moves in rhythm, not noise. And it's in the pause where meaning settles, where emotion lands, where the listener finally has room to feel what you're trying to say. The poet Rumi once wrote, "There is a voice that doesn't use words. Listen." That voice lives in the pauses, in the moments you don't rush to fill, in the space you hold with presence, not performance. Most people speak to avoid discomfort. They fear the silence might be mistaken for uncertainty or worse, weakness, so they fill it with filler words, fast speech, or nervous energy. But when you become comfortable with the pause, you stop trying to control the room. You start commanding it, not with volume, but with calm. Because silence is not absence, it's presence without pressure. It's a signal to the listener, I'm here, I'm thoughtful, I'm not trying to overwhelm you, I'm inviting you in. The pause also reflects trust, not just in the audience, but in yourself. You're not afraid of being misinterpreted because your intention is clear. You're not afraid of not knowing because you've made peace with imperfection. And so the pause becomes more than a technique. It becomes a philosophy, a rhythm of respect. And from the listener's perspective, Pauses are where they catch what you're saying. It's where they reflect, where they feel safe enough to process rather than just react. If you speak too fast, you might sound intelligent, but you'll likely leave no space for real resonance. But if you give your words room to breathe, they begin to live in the mind of the person listening. And that's when communication becomes transformation. So here's the invitation. Stop fearing the silence. Lean into it. Let it shape the rhythm of your speech, not disrupt it. Let it be the frame that makes your words more vivid, more grounded, more real. Because sometimes what you don't say, what you leave suspended in the space between, is what people remember most. Every word you speak is a reflection of what you stand for, whether you realize it or not. The way you communicate, the tone you use, the intention behind your message. It all reveals something about the alignment between your outer voice and your inner world. And that's why speaking with purpose isn't just about being articulate. It's about being honest with yourself, about letting your words reflect your values, not just your thoughts. Too often, we say what's expected, what's safe, what fits into the moment, even if it doesn't fit with who we are. But the more we do that, the more we dilute ourselves. And the more we dilute our speech, the less it carries. Because words that don't come from a place of integrity may sound right, but they rarely feel right. Aristotle once said, "Character may almost be called the most effective means of persuasion." And it's true. People respond not just to your message, but to your consistency, your coherence, your ability to speak in a way that's not only convincing, but congruent. Because when your words match your actions, your values, your deeper self, there's a strength that can't be faked. It's not charisma, it's not cleverness, it's trust. And trust is magnetic. It draws people in, not because you're perfect, but because you're real. You're not speaking to manipulate, you're not performing, you're communicating from a place that's anchored, steady, true. Speaking with purpose also means being willing to pause and ask, why am I saying this? What part of me is speaking? My ego, my fear, or something deeper? Because when you start filtering your words through intention rather than impulse, something shifts. Your communication becomes cleaner, more focused, less reactive, and people feel safer around you, not because you always say what they want to hear, but because they know what you say comes from a clear place. This kind of alignment isn't loud. It doesn't need to be. You don't have to shout your truth when you're living it. It's felt in the tone of your voice, the steadiness of your gaze, the confidence that comes from not needing to prove anything. And, over time, that consistency becomes your signature, not your volume, not your vocabulary, but your integrity. So take a moment and ask yourself, do my words reflect who I want to be? Do they match the principles I claim to live by? Or am I compromising them, slowly, quietly, for the sake of convenience or comfort? Because every time you speak, you're not just communicating information, you're communicating identity. And when your identity is anchored in purpose, your words don't need to be many, just true. Leadership is often associated with direction, control, clarity. But there's a kind of leadership that doesn't raise its voice, doesn't dominate the room, and doesn't need to be the loudest person at the table. It leads not through command, but through presence. And at the heart of that presence is silence. We're used to associating leadership with action, with quick answers, bold decisions, strong declarations. But the best leaders know when not to speak, when to listen instead, when to pause and absorb before responding, when to hold space so others can rise. That's not weakness, it's wisdom. Lao Tzu said, "A leader is best when people barely know he exists. When his work is done, his aim fulfilled, they will say, 'We did it ourselves.' That kind of invisible leadership is rare. It requires restraint, trust, the humility to step back and allow others to step forward. And that restraint often shows up in silence. Silence doesn't mean absence, it means intention. When a leader holds silence before speaking, the room leans in. People pay attention, not because they're being forced to, but because the leader is modeling presence, calm, discernment. And in a world driven by noise, that kind of stillness feels like gravity. Silence also makes space for reflection. In fast-moving environments, decisions are often rushed, but great leadership requires stillness between movements. That space allows clarity to emerge. It prevents reaction from replacing response. And it reminds everyone in the room that speed without awareness is just another form of chaos. When a leader speaks only when necessary, their words carry more weight, not because they're rare, but because they're rooted in consideration, in values, in vision. You don't need many words when each one is deliberate. You don't need to speak constantly when your presence already communicates trust. This kind of leadership is not about charisma. It's not about commanding attention. It's about earning it, quietly, steadily, through consistency and emotional clarity. And that kind of influence doesn't fade when the meeting ends. It lingers, because people remember how you made them feel, not how many times you spoke. So if you lead in any capacity, whether in your work, your family, your community, ask yourself, are you filling the air to feel in control, or are you creating space for real alignment to happen? Because silence, when held with purpose, becomes a mirror. It reveals what's real. It calms what's reactive. It empowers others to think, to speak, to grow. And in that kind of space, leadership becomes something deeper than authority. It becomes service. There's a quiet transformation that happens when you no longer feel the need to speak, just to be heard, when you stop trying to prove, persuade, or impress, and instead choose to speak only when it truly adds something meaningful to the space. This isn't about shrinking or withdrawing. It's about evolving, about stepping into a version of yourself that trusts depth more than noise, substance more than style. We live in a world where saying less is often misread as being unsure or disengaged. But those who have truly done the inner work, who have faced themselves in silence, know otherwise. They know that restraint is not a lack of expression. It's a form of mastery, a kind of self-respect that refuses to waste energy on what doesn't matter. The philosopher Seneca once wrote, "Speech is to be kept short and to the point. Say what needs to be said, then be silent." That might sound strict, even harsh. But behind those words is a profound truth. When you no longer chase validation through speech, your presence begins to speak for itself. When you speak less, you start listening more, not just to others, but to your own inner rhythms. You become more aware of what you're actually feeling before turning it into language. You give yourself space to respond instead of react. And over time, this shift reshapes not just how you communicate, but who you become. You become the person in the room who doesn't need to control it, the one who can stay grounded while others fill the space with urgency, the one who speaks slowly, but whose words stay long after they've been spoken. Not because they were clever, but because they were true. And this isn't just about conversations, it's about energy. The more you practice intentional silence, the more you conserve your focus for what actually matters. You stop exhausting yourself in explanations. You stop reacting to every comment or conflict. You stop needing to have the last word. That doesn't mean you abandon your voice. It means you refine it. You use it when it's aligned, when it's clean, when it's coming from clarity, not confusion. And what you'll find is that people begin to listen differently. They begin to lean in. They begin to sense that when you do speak, it's worth listening to. Not because you're louder, but because you're clearer. Not because you're everywhere, but because you've learned to speak only from your center. So ask yourself, gently, what would happen if you stopped chasing impact through volume? What if your words were fewer, but fuller? What kind of presence could you build, not by saying more, but by becoming more intentional with every breath? Because in the end, transformation doesn't come from saying everything. It comes from saying the right thing and knowing when nothing more needs to be said. In the age of constant connection, silence has become uncomfortable, almost suspicious. If you're not posting, replying, updating, or commenting, people start to wonder, are you okay? Are you falling behind? Are you still relevant? But maybe the real question is this: have we mistaken visibility for value? And if so, what have we sacrificed in the process? We're living in a world that rewards speed over depth, volume over clarity, presence over intention. But when everyone is speaking at once, who's really being heard? And more importantly, who's actually listening? In this digital storm of opinions, algorithms, and endless scrolling, choosing to say less, especially online, can feel like you're disappearing. But silence doesn't mean absence. It can also mean strength. It can mean discernment. It can mean you're choosing depth over noise, choosing not to speak until you have something worth saying. As the writer Khalil Gibran once put it, you talk when you cease to be at peace with your thoughts. That hits even harder today, when we're constantly broadcasting our every reaction, sometimes before we've even processed what we feel. But real peace doesn't seek an audience. It doesn't demand a response. It speaks only when the moment truly asks for it. You don't have to comment on everything. You don't have to respond immediately. You don't need to join every conversation or prove your existence through activity. The more intentional you become with your voice, digitally or otherwise, the more impact it actually carries. When you post from a place of silence rather than urgency, people feel it. Your message has space. It's not competing. It's not chasing. It's just grounded. And in a world so addicted to reaction, groundedness feels revolutionary. This isn't about going off the grid or disappearing. It's about being deliberate with your digital voice, about asking yourself before you post, is this aligned with who I am? Is this adding noise or offering clarity? Am I reacting or am I responding from my center? Because the internet doesn't need more content. It needs more consciousness, more people willing to pause, to reflect, to choose silence over spectacle, substance over speed. So maybe next time before you speak, whether in person or through a screen, you pause, not because you're afraid, but because you've remembered something most people have forgotten, that the loudest presence in the room is often the one that doesn't need to speak at all. There's a certain kind of leader who doesn't dominate the room, yet somehow holds it. They don't speak often, but when they do, everyone listens. Their voice isn't sharp, it's steady. Their influence doesn't come from authority. It comes from alignment. And the most striking thing about them isn't how much they say, but how little they need to say. This is the leadership of restraint, of presence, of essence over effort. It's not loud, It's not theatrical, it's grounded, intentional, and deeply human. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, known for leading an empire in silence more than spectacle, once wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be one." That's the kind of leadership that speaks more in action than in argument. It doesn't demand attention. It earns trust through consistency, through clarity, through quiet strength. And this kind of strength is rare today. In a world filled with endless commentary, the true leader is the one who chooses their words, like a sculptor chooses stone, not to impress, but to shape. They understand that communication isn't about controlling people, it's about connecting with them. And sometimes the deepest form of connection begins in silence. The most influential leaders speak less, not because they don't have something to say, but because they're listening, observing, feeling the weight of the moment. They know that silence isn't a lack of direction, it's a preparation for it. And when they speak, it's from stillness, not stress. This doesn't mean avoiding your voice, it means honoring it. It means knowing that your leadership doesn't come from how much space you take up, but from how much space you hold for others. Not from how fast you respond, but from how fully you understand. True leadership is about discernment, about knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to say nothing at all. And that kind of silence, quiet, grounded, intentional, isn't empty. It's full of direction, full of presence, full of quiet power. So if you want to lead, whether in your career, your relationships, or your personal life, don't ask yourself how to be louder. Ask yourself how to be clearer, how to speak with more truth and less noise, how to be the kind of person whose words matter not because they're many, but because they mean something. Because in the end, your greatest influence will never be in how often you speak, but in who you are when you do. We often think the path to impact lies in saying more passion, more detail, more visibility, but maybe it's the opposite. Maybe what the world needs, what you need, is not another flood of words, but a return to presence, a return to meaning, a return to the kind of speech that doesn't just fill silence, but honors it. In a world addicted to noise, choosing to speak with intention is an act of defiance. It says, I don't need to perform to be heard. I don't need to explain myself to have value. I don't need to fill every space to belong here. Because when your voice comes from alignment, when your words rise from stillness, they don't just inform, they transform. They don't just land, they linger. Not because they were loud, but because they were true. So take this with you. Speak less, not because you're afraid, but because you've learned the difference between talking and communicating. Because you've felt the power of listening, of pausing, of being the calm center in a world that rushes to respond. Let your words carry weight. Let your silence hold meaning. Let your presence be enough. And remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all.